Hey, how you doing? It's been a while. If you don't know who I am, my name is John Solano. I've been a practicing counselor for over 33 years. My specialty is really it's in addition to traditional psychology, it's in transpersonal psychology, meaning mythology, spiritual traditions, basically just looking at uh, wisdom teachings and the practices that have helped people heal and transform since the beginning of time. So I hope you've had a chance to look at the videos on my channel. There's over 90 videos that address so many different topics. Um, what I do in these videos is I try to give you kind of my take on what I see going on. And maybe it's helpful for you, and maybe it also can validate some things that maybe have been on your mind and heart. One of the things that I've been thinking about for quite a while is why it seems there's been, maybe over the last 10 years especially, this desire for so many people to I guess do a couple of things, just kind of really define themselves in terms of identity, but at the same time also want to move away from the identities that they have. There's almost a, what's going on to me, it seems like so much activity around identity. And of course, the question around that is, who am I? What is my identity? And it's, just what's going on across the globe, but, certainly in the West is incredibly diverse. I mean, you've got groups of people who want to reclaim their cultural, historic identity um, as the lifeblood of who they are, that without this identity that they're they're personal, social, spiritual, physical, mental lives are so attached to that, and without that, they collapse. On the other hand, you've got people who kind of know who they are, if you will, or kind of where they've come from anyway, who they've come from, their personal culture and family situation and things. And those people want to seem to scurry away as quickly as possible from those identities to find something else. Um, it's gotten, I suppose you could say, and I'm going to say this just kind of a bit, I don't know what you want to call it, it's surreal. I think when some of our community, sit back and witness people wanting to take on identities as if it were just like a shirt that you take on and off, at will, and I think there, we can all sense that there's something off about that, but at the same time, there's a strong movement that wants to validate that. So, if you say that you're of a particular ethnic culture, let's say that you're Caucasian, right now it's like the playing field is wide open. You could claim to be of another tradition, of another race, of another creed. You can be born a particular biological, genetically kind of biologically kind of traits, and you can supposedly choose something different. So if you're born a man, you could just say you're a woman, even though you have all the biological genetic characteristics of being a man. I know there's discussion around gender fluidity, things of this nature, but that fluidity that people want to lay claim to only further speaks to the idea that people want, it seems, the ability to be able to move fluidly, or without barrier, without obstacle, to whatever they choose to be. So and it's almost like a smorgasbord of things that you can choose to be, to claim as your identity. Now, I'm not here to kind of take this into political realm. I approach this with a kind of a clinical, spiritual, wisdom teaching curiosity about what could be going on. Why do I say that? Because one of the things that we know from a mythological, spiritual, theological standpoint is that there's this term called disidentification. So what that means is that, like, say, for instance, from more of an Eastern perspective, spiritual perspective, they talk a lot about detachment. So in other words, don't hang on too tightly to things, because when we hang on too tightly to things, um, we kind of lose ourselves. So things that we hang on too tightly to can become barriers between us and who we truly are as authentic human beings. And so it's the same way in Western practices, if you will, spiritual practices, um, is that if we begin to attach to something, to cling on to something more than our, what people might call our best self or higher self or divine self or Christ self, if we cling on to things more than that, then it actually gets in the way of us really authentically knowing who we are. So it's a major challenge. It's a major task. It's a major task of maturity as well, in developmental psychology, to be able to sit and reflect on what things that we're holding on to too tightly. In kind of a more of a Western approach, we could see, for instance, how addiction, if you will, which is kind of an extreme form of attachment, that an addiction that somebody has would get in the way of them becoming their best self in the world. But we know as human beings that we can become addicted to almost anything. So if not anything. So that doesn't mean just substances. It also means we can become addicted to our thoughts. We can become overly attached to our identity. And so our identities begin to be a barrier, or shall I put it this way, that our attachment becomes the barrier. Being overly attached, that overly latching onto becomes the barrier. Why do I say that? Well, let me add this to either clarify things or mucky up the waters here a little bit. Now, I've done a lot of videos on the existence of narcissism, and this is something that we all need to understand. The kind of the basis of who we are as human beings, it contains a deep core of narcissism. And I explain that in terms of like 3 different characteristics: narcissism, egocentricity, and grandiosity. Narcissism, is really the term that we hear most people use. And that really just means and these are pathological. Like, it means that this is something that takes a person really away from reality rather than towards reality. We could also say it's a trait of the immature. It's a trait of the immature mind, and that part of growing up. And I think we all know this, that we all have to be disciplined. We all have to enter into a discipline because we need discipline in order to grow up and in order to mature. What does that mean? It means to think less of ourselves. It means to be more empathetic, more compassionate, being willing to make a contribution to the world. And if you're a parent, this, and this is your heart's desire for your children. But all of us, when we talk about becoming better people, that's what we're really talking about, is moving away from an arrogant, narcissistic position, because when we're in those positions, we just become very self-centered. And again, that means immaturity. That means almost being infantile. We all probably know people who are like that, who are focused on themselves, and narcissism fuels that. And it really means this person thinks that they're super special, more special than anybody else. And there's really no reason for it. They're just special in and of themselves. So there's a huge ripple effect in society when people are that way. And then the egocentricity means that this person thinks that the world revolves around them, and the grandiosity is kind of like they think that they know everything, that they're omniscient, omnipotent, they're all powerful, all knowing, and you can't tell them anything. They just think they know everything and that they're all that. And so I use these words to describe this, but really it's a pathological thing that's very serious. But it is also something that is deeply embedded in everybody's human psyche. And again, that's why we all need to grow up. That's why we need to mature. So here we have it. We have this. We all want to grow up. We all want to be what we might call more self-actualized, become more authentic as a human being. And yet the proper way that's done, if you will, the right way that's done is through sacrifice. So when we think about having to grow up, it means leaving behind stuff. So we have to make sacrifices. I'm not going to say a lot about that, but it is absolutely key to the human psyche to be involved in giving things up in order to reach the next level of maturity. Now, when you think about a narcissist who thinks that they're super special and the world should revolve around them and they know everything, do you think a narcissist wants to give up anything? No, right? So, one of the things, I suppose, this is such a big topic, but one of the things that we all know is that we all have strengths and talents and abilities, but we also have blind spots, that none of us are perfect, right? We all grow up in families of imperfect people. We grow up in communities who are imperfect. And that's a source of, great, pain and suffering, disillusionment, abuse, whatever it is. But that's kind of the lay of the land. There's no way to escape that. But see, that an immature person wants to escape that. See, the immature person and a narcissistic person, what do they want to do? Is that they think that somehow they don't deserve that. They live in a fantasy land of thinking that if they only could be somewhere else, that this would be, nirvana. Um, Sometimes in addiction, we call that geographical escape. That if I could just, leave where I live, if I could move to a new community, if I could leave my marriage, if I could leave and go somewhere else. And actually, it's kind of like packing your bags and going where you think is a paradise, but you forget that you actually packed your bags. You bring your baggage with you. And so it's a fantasy. And immature people live in fantasy. That's a sign of immaturity and stunted psychological development, especially when you see that in an adult. But again, with narcissism, there's a drive towards instant gratification. And there's a feeling of entitlement, meaning like I'm entitled to better. I don't deserve this. And so, imagine that a person has this going on in their psyche, and they're not happy with their own life, not happy with who they are in their own bodies, not happy with who they are in their own presentation. And, they feel a sense of discomfort possibly in that place. Well, welcome to the planet. We all feel a sense of discomfort in that place. And yet we know developmentally, as mature people, really the task of maturity is to love yourself, to love your surroundings, to love yourself just the way you are, kind of the hand of cards that's been dealt to you. The more immature a person is, the more they complain about the hand of cards that they've been dealt. Everybody gets dealt a hand of cards, and it's not about folding your hand and looking for a new hand. It's about being able to play that hand in the best possible way. That's what maturity is all about. And so we get a good view of this in more of a spiritual capacity. So a narcissist will just want to kind of cash in the chips and move to another identity, let's say. I don't like the identity that I have. I'm uncomfortable in it. It doesn't really kind of feel like it fits. I'm not feeling a lot of joy or pleasure. Again, that's the pursuit of the narcissist, who seeks instant gratification, who always moving towards some self-gratification, and that means avoiding pain at all costs, blaming others, even blaming their identity, blaming the government, blame. That is the terrain of the immature. That is the terrain of the infant. That is the terrain of the narcissist. So there's that. That's kind of the I think more than anything, the path that we're seeing. And so we're seeing a lot of this, people scrambling around trying to take the hand of cards they've been dealt and fold it up and say, I want another hand. And not only do I want another hand, I want another hand whenever I want another hand. And so there's all these different groups, if you will, of cards out here. And hey, you know what? If I don't find the group that I'm looking for, I'll make my own up. Have you ever seen little children do that? Maybe they're playing a card game or whatever, and they feel a little bit thwarted or a little bit blocked in the game, and then all of a sudden they'll start to make up their own rules. They don't want to kind of play within the rules. They want to make up their own rule, and consequently that's either ends up one or two ways. It's either that it bothers everybody else and the person kind of becomes, exiled from the group, or everybody makes up their own rules and pretty soon everybody's just so disconnected and disintegrated because nobody can ever be on the same playing field. So here's the idea that the spiritual disciplines that the wisdom teachings offer. It's that, again, yes, we all feel a sense of dis-ease in who we are and where we belong. Um, and yet we must make peace with that. And so how oftentimes how we see it is that we go off to spiritual retreats, or you see people take on a monastic life, or people will go to a quiet place and meditate and begin to see how that identity is constructed and to begin to kind of dismantle it. And and when one starts to look at one's thoughts in meditation, in reflection, in mindfulness, in prayer, you realize that the barrier is not outside yourself. The barrier is your own perceptions. And so what you begin to disidentify from is not you as a person, but those thoughts that and behaviors and ways of being that aren't a true reflection of your best self. So there's almost like three stages. First, there's this disillusionment piece where we're unsatisfied with our current position, our current place in life, who we are. And that can be anything. You might be disillusioned in your job. You might be disillusioned or whatever, uncomfortable in your relationships. You might be uncomfortable as a functioning parent. You might be uncomfortable with yourself and how you're conducting yourself and the struggles that you might be having with a mental health issue or an addiction issue or a behavioral issue or whatever it is, or or the amount of money that you have or the car that you drive or the size of your house. There's so much to be disgruntled and disillusioned about. So there are plenty of things. So we find ourselves in that place, and then we go on the journey. And for some people, like for the narcissist, the journey is to satisfy itself, to avoid the pain of that, to pursue instant gratification, and to do whatever it needs to do to continue to fulfill its fantasy of being the top dog, super special, all-knowing, that the world should revolve around itself. The spiritual path is almost the opposite of that, where we realize that, we do have this somehow inflated sense of entitlement, and that comes from a very immature place. And the more we can work with that sense of entitlement and do what's necessary to see it for what it is, the more we see it for what it is, what it will eventually generate is humility. In other words, the realization that the thing we're hanging on to, the thoughts, the ideas that we're hanging on to that are causing us misery are really the culprit. And those are generated by ourselves. And when we realize that, we experience breakthroughs, we experience humility, we experience gratitude. We hear spiritual masters talk about being present. In order to be present, and when you're present, there's this awe, there's this wonder, there's this joy that starts to return, because somehow the moment is enough, and who you're being in the moment is enough, and who your spouse is being in the moment is enough, and what's going on at work is enough. And the fact you experience a tremendous amount of gratitude for the things that are in your life, because you've caught a glimpse of the real human condition and the condition that you're in. And it's not a good condition. It's not very good. And so when we can see ourselves in the reality of that, and then also the reality that we have so much around us to be grateful for, that we're humbled in that, and our level of gratitude increases. So that's kind of stage two. So disillusionment, then there's mindfulness and meditation to see, how we're our own worst enemy, if you will. And then the third stage of that is peace and contentment, that we are content with who we are. Now, let me speak practically about just one experience of this that I had, and maybe others can relate. Is that, when you grow up as a kid and you witness your parents and how they conduct themselves and how your family members conduct themselves, and you might come away like I did with some disillusionment about a parent. And for me, and usually it's both, but sometimes it can be one more than the other, or it can be just one. But in my case, it was one more than the other. It was my dad first, and then my mom. And of course, when you have grievances against, you know, the very people who have raised you and brought you into the world, and I'm adopted, so they definitely brought me into the world and raised me. But for others of you who have a genetic link to the folks who raised you, even more so, that we would have grievances against those very things. Those very people, I often think of it as your parents are your legs when you grow up. And I've been a counselor for 33 years, so I see this, that when people have serious grievances against their family members, especially their parents, and they maintain those grievances, they go through life with a lack of capacity, like a limp. And I often think, well, that's because, like, you attacked your own legs. Like, what do you think you walk on when you're young? You don't walk on your own power, your own steam. You walk on the power of your parents. So anyway, I had these grievances against my dad, my mom. And then as I grew up, right, I think if you're older, if you will, you realize that, geez, you start to get more insight and more understanding about why your parents did what they did. And I also, because I've had a long interest in psychology and spirituality, was involved in a bit of a discipline around that. So I, spent time in reflection and mindfulness and prayer to see how I might be my own worst enemy, how I might be getting in the way of these relationships being better than what they were. And I found my fingerprints everywhere. Now, of course, that's, to the narcissist, that's the bad news. They don't want to find their fingerprints anywhere. That, they want to be squeaky clean. Remember, I'm special, I'm perfect. The world should revolve around me. There's nothing wrong with me. That's what a narcissist would say. But a more mature person, and as we mature, we realize, hey, you know what, maybe my fingerprints are on this more than I thought. And there's humility involved in that. And so, to make a long story short, I went through that 3-step process with my parents. Now, what's the good news about that? Is the good news is that you can change your childhood, you can change your memories. It's almost like exchanging the, I don't know, the self-created BS that we come up with for reality, for the real story. And so what began to emerge for my parents was a great love and appreciation and reverence and honor. And my only wish as I got older was to be just like them, to be buried by their side, if you will. If that was enough, it was enough to be my dad's son. It was enough to be my mom's son. That was enough. That was amazing in and of itself. And so I was able to transform what was what started out as a very negative, complaint filled narrative about who I was. See, that's disidentification. I didn't need to run off to to become something radically different. It wasn't that. I mean, my dis-ease, my problems were self-created, and I needed to disidentify from that false identity that I created and when I did that, it revealed a new identity. But I was still the same person. Like, I was still me in my body, in my neighborhood, how I grew up. So that would be the kind of the maturational path, if you will, the correct developmental path, the path of masters, if you will, a more theological, spiritual path. That being said, it's just what it means to grow up. So when I see all these people scurrying around, giving up and giving up their homes and their families, and they're trying to give up their biology and genetics. Um, I see people desiring that deep transformation, but when it's in the hands of a narcissist in a narcissistic society, it ends up being nothing more than travel war, um, radical intersectionality, and people scrambling between various groups and identities, and nobody's happy. So I hope this has been helpful. Take care.